Well, welcome everybody to the webinar. We're going to give it another 30 seconds or so to hopefully people can join. So for those that did not attend the first session, part one of this, we're going to get that up, the recording up as a YouTube video here shortly. So be on the lookout for that. It'd be good for you to review some of the concepts we talked about in part one of the video. I'm going to cover some of that material in a more simplified fashion as we go through this session. And if you have any questions from the part one session, you're welcome to put those into the chat to ask as we go, and as we go through the presentation with the new material as well. Feel free to chat any questions, and we'll get to those as we can during the presentation. So just, I think we're got a few of you already online. We expected 30 or 40 people perhaps. So I'm just going to pop out my chat here. All right. Well, hopefully everyone can see the slides. This is using ERP Armor rules for ERP Cloud to test access controls using SafePaaS. And we went a little bit longer than I expected in the first part. The goal in the first part one is to be able to get through some of the role design and user provisioning aspects. We didn't get through that, so we're going to get through that today. And then we've got quite a few more sessions. We have 3 more sessions after this. We're going to cover other aspects of different types of access controls or scenarios that can be used via SafePaaS software and ERP Armor rules. So for those that didn't attend the last session, there would be some helpful prerequisites to this, and all 3 of these are webinars that we've done from prior sessions. So the custom roles, data security policies, privileges, OMI, that is a webinar we did with Donna Curtis, who's our ERP Cloud Practice Manager at ERP Risk Advisors. That is available on demand via our learning platform. And then we've done the last 2 quarters, we've done webinars on 23A and 23B. That's available. And if you stay on to the end, I've got a special offer, another free offer for some CPE that I'll cover as we wrap up the slides. So as you go through this, and if you want access to these as prerequisites, these are all free 1-hour CPE sessions. You can send an email to open a ticket with us, which is support@erpra.net. So support@erpra.net, and that's where you can send questions or open tickets to us on an ongoing basis. So our agenda, we're going to cover, I'm going to briefly kind of go through SOD conflicts and sensitive access risk defined, talk about what ERP Armor rules are, and then we're going to walk through these couple different scenarios today in around user provisioning and role design. So just briefly, I covered this in the last session. For those that missed, I'm going to cover this just quickly here. When you're looking at risks within access controls, it's not just compliance risks. There are other things that need to be evaluated. I think the access control community, if you will, or the software community and the implementers are highly focused on compliance, which is typically thought of as Sarbanes-Oxley for us in the US. But there are a lot of other reasons to test access controls. Fraud that would be like below the materiality level, or what we would call sub-material fraud, is definitely something that should be monitored on an ongoing basis. So kind of lower level fraud that wouldn't maybe rise to the level of materiality that Sarbanes-Oxley would require. Operational risk, so anything that you're looking at that would be relevant to the operations of your business, which is configurations, master data, and that type of thing. So that'll be things that would be covered by access control testing. Cybersecurity is something that often is overlooked. People think like in SaaS applications like ERP Cloud, Workday, or NetSuite, that cybersecurity risks are really managed by the software provider, and to the extent that the perimeter is protected, that is accurate. That most organizations don't have primary cybersecurity or ransomware risk. but there are internet-facing components of each of the SaaS applications, and there is risk of fraud and data theft or data security in those applications that need to be managed by management internally. So we do look at cybersecurity as a risk that should be managed via access control when we're thinking about the SaaS applications in particular, since those applications are internet-facing. And then licensing, a lot of organizations don't think about this as a risk, but effectively, if you're overusing applications, licensing is a risk to the organization, because you could have an invoice coming from Oracle that provides a significant value that needs to be accrued. So that's the licensing cost. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. So access controls really should be something that all the C-level suite would be concerned about. So the CFO thinking about it from a compliance perspective, CIO and CISO, the SOX, PMO, and the COO, everybody has a reason to be concerned about access controls. And what our challenge with as practitioners is trying to get everybody, in terms of giving the requirements and giving them the data they need to be able to satisfy these different stakeholders or these different types of risks, where often it's IT that manages the applications like SafePaaS to be able to test access controls and user provisioning and such. The stakeholders, the people that really care about whether access controls are properly defined and the controls are operating effectively, it should span the entire C-suite. So our goal is, in this series of classes, is to make you, maybe as the administrator or the auditor of access control software, have a broader picture of an understanding, and maybe expand your view of the things that you could be using SafePaaS for to be able to test for these different stakeholders. So just briefly, I'm going to talk about SOD, what an SOD risk is in a sense of access risk. People really think they understand the priority of these, if you will. So people are very heavily focused on segregation duties, which is the separation between one function and another. Sometimes you think about the authorization activities that are happening. So somebody initiates something, somebody authorizes it. Sometimes we're trying to separate the custody of an asset from the maintenance of the activities within the system. Most people think about segregation duties in the context of what happens within a system, not necessarily a combination of things happens outside the system and happening in the system. So some examples of common SOD issues is like maintaining, entering suppliers, and then maintaining payables invoices. And so most of the time when we see access control software being used, they are using it to test segregation of duties, because they're thinking more of it from a compliance perspective. How do I prevent fraud between suppliers and invoices, or suppliers and purchase orders? How do I make sure that the activities are being properly authorized, where that somebody's initiating something doesn't also approve things? So that's, in modern ERP systems, it's mostly being driven by the implementation of workflows. So like there's a lot of new workflows in systems like Workday and NetSuite and ERP Cloud, where it does naturally segregate the entry and approval of those activities. But then there are cases where there are risks across activities, so suppliers and invoices. That would be a traditional segregation duties risk. The reality is, from a compliance perspective, in most modern ERP systems, especially systems that have been implemented in the last few years, a lot of the SOD risk is really mitigated through the implementation of workflow. So you could implement a product like ERP Cloud, and you could either choose to implement workflows or not. Most organizations are implementing workflows because they're trying to get the most value out of the system and trying to automate controls, put preventive controls in as opposed to detective controls. So the question, whenever you think about from a workflow perspective, what's being implemented, is it the entire process? Is it inserts, updates, and deletes, or is it inserts or additions and changes? And a addition workflow, or a new vendor, for example, would be one workflow process. A change to a workflow would be another process. And you do have to think about like what elements are being built into the workflow. So like suppliers, we typically would think the high risk areas would be name, address, bank account, and contact information. So all of those things should be subject to workflow. So what you're going to want to do is evaluate the workflow for its completeness to make sure that it's addressing all the risks associated with that given business process. And so like this first example, enter suppliers, enter and maintain payables invoices. If you think about that as trying to separate those two, if one or both sides of those are subject to workflow approval process where somebody can't enter a supplier and have it be used without an approval process, or saying it differently, somebody can't enter a supplier and approve their own supplier because the workflow is automatically going to route it to somebody independent of the person that's entering the supplier to begin with, then that is a fully mitigated risk. That's the challenge. I think I always say on the front end, even before you get into a project of determining what it is that you should be evaluating from an SOD and sensitive access perspective, you should be having an understanding of what workflow processes are in place and determining whether those workflow, the design is complete and it's consistent with management's expectations of mitigating risks in that process. Now, having said that, I'm going to move down to kind of the sensitive access risk section, because when we typically work on a project like an implementation of SafePaaS, what we would be doing is evaluating independent sensitive access risks. So we would take vendor master maintenance and we would look at that across all roles and the users that have those roles if you're already live with the system. So we look at vendor master maintenance as a sensitive access risk, and we ask ourselves the question, does anybody have access through a role that's not appropriate? So all users and all roles would be evaluated. Typically, we look at the role first, and we say, does it make sense that this role has the ability to maintain enter and maintain vendors? And that's really the importance of sensitive access risk. We're going to talk about that as we go through the concept of evaluating role design. Is if our library is full of SOD conflicts, but it doesn't have sensitive access risks associated with it, then we're not going to be able to test roles effectively. So like if a role has, if I take the first example, I'll take the second example on the SOD side, that they have both suppliers and POs. The role has it. The role has it. If you test role design and you're looking for a segregation of duties within a role, then that role will have it, and then that'll pop as an SOD risk. But let's just say it has suppliers, but it doesn't have purchase orders. In and of itself, the entry and maintenance of suppliers is a risk in and of itself because of the ability to change one of those fields, the name, the address, the bank account, or the contact information. So just having access to suppliers in and of itself is a risk. So if you're using enter suppliers, enter purchase orders as a test of role design, and that was your only test to evaluate the risk within it, if it didn't have POs but it had suppliers, then your SOD conflict would not pop as part of that role design. So what I want you to think about is sensitive access risks are really the starting point for looking at access control risks. We want to evaluate role design risks. Everything that we think has risk in and of itself, vendor master, purchase orders, the ability to provision users, maintaining roles as examples, things that go through change control, all those things should be built into your sensitive access risk library so that you can evaluate which roles have access to each one of those activities. That's very different than I think what we see in most SOD projects or access control projects. Is they're, I would say, overly weighted in many respects and looking at segregation duties risks, and significantly underweighted looking at sensitive access risks. Matter of fact, we were on a project with a customer recently, and one of the big four firms was implementing advanced access controls, the Oracle product that kind of competes with SafePaaS. So they had purchased the Oracle product, and we were there kind of helping the client evaluate whether the firm was going to do a good job. So kind of QAing that project, and we asked them to present how they were going to test the roles as part of the pre-go live process. and the only thing they presented to the client were segregation duties conflicts. I'm like, you cannot test roles effectively just looking at SOD conflicts. Based upon my example, like in and of itself, vendor master maintenance may be a risk, is a risk, and if you don't have as an example, sensitive access risk, just looking for who has vendor master maintenance, then your rules engine to test role design as part of the project is incomplete. And we would make that argument, everything that isn't an SOD conflict, like suppliers, invoices, purchase orders, roles, users, all those should be built to sensitive access risks. So as we're going to see in the demo a little bit, you can evaluate what roles have access to those sensitive access objects, and potentially identifying a role that shouldn't have access to it that needs to come out in and of itself, just that one activity. So I would say we are a security company first, looking at sensitive access risks, and then we look at segregation duties second. So I've kind of covered this: SOD first, or sensitive access first, SOD second. Certainly need to understand if workflow processes have been implemented. So ERP Armor is our what we call our risk content. We're the only risk content company in the world. So what we do is we build and maintain SOD and sensitive access rules based upon risks. And so just briefly, what we cover for ERP Cloud: we have privileges mapped to sensitive access risk. We have duty roles mapped to sensitive access risk. We have data security policies mapped to sensitive access risks. And then we have combinations of those built into SOD conflicts. So some examples of privileges mapped to risks. You can see in a case of a rule, like a rule ID FC001, enter journals, who has the ability to enter journals, start the journal process, could be subject to journal approval workflow, could not be subject to journal approval workflow, depending upon which privilege. We have those grouped into a like risk, and the risk really is unauthorized, journal entries where nobody reviews or approves them independently before they are posted against the balance sheet or posted against the financial statements. So a rule could be one privilege, or it could be multiple privileges. So you can see the first FC001 is multiple privileges. And then we also actually map page abilities as well. So page abilities are what gives you access to a form within the application. It doesn't necessarily mean you can transact. You can't always do insert, updates, or deletes. Usually you can't via page ability. Most page abilities are just view-only access to the data. But we do map those to be able to differentiate who has the access in the front end. And a lot of times, what we're looking for is, in and of itself, are they creating false positives? So if that's all they have, and maybe we're comparing what we're doing to another firm that's running an assessment, we want to highlight that the access that people have is just a page ability and isn't insert, update, or delete. A couple other things we look at: configurations. We've got probably a couple hundred privileges that are focused on who has access to something, who has access to the things that should go through change control. So I'm going to talk about the concept of rule tags and how you would run a rule tag within SafePaaS to be able to test a broad set of risks. One of the rule tags we have is called a change management rule tag, and what we have in that is everything we expect to go through change control. So we can run this rule tag, and it gives you a broad view of what roles have access to enter or maintain something that should be going through change control. Administer security profiles is a good example. Even a better example probably would be profile option value changes, or there's a lot of default seated roles have access to maintain some descriptive flex fields. And those, by running an assessment of our change control tag, we can clearly identify what roles have access to things that should be going through change control, and typically what we're focusing on there are any of those end user roles as opposed to IT roles. And then I would say, don't forget the concept of APIs and web services. Those are critical from a mass update. Often they are used for integrations, or they really should be used for integrations primarily. But they're contained in a lot of seeded roles, especially in the financial side where the APIs aren't needed for the UI to work, the user interface to work. So that's often where we're identifying a need for role remediation comes from access to APIs or web services. There are also cases where duty roles pose risk in and of themselves. So like what we call it a shell. So it doesn't have any specific privileges to point to. And there's some examples here of duty roles. So the scanning engine, like SafePaaS, does have to incorporate the ability to both scan privileges and duty roles, and your risk library you're looking for has to include certain duty roles. Some have high risk, some have access to sensitive data in subject areas. And another challenge organizations have are data security policies, which are being more used in the differentiation of security. I think the functionality for DSPs is coming out in the next version of SafePaaS, if I remember correctly. So we haven't started building rules yet, but we certainly have to take into account DSPs, and DSPs is data security policies for short. We have to take those into account when we are designing security. So sensitive access first, SOD second. We talked about some examples of sensitive access risks. From an SOD conflict perspective, a lot of organizations understand what those are. Common SOD enter journals versus post journals. Usually it's going to be mitigated through a journal approval workflow process. So that's a transactional type SOD conflict. The second example, FC051, is what we call a transaction versus configuration. Actually, both FC051 and FC310 are examples of that, where you want to pair whatever configurations that are related to the workflow design in this case. So managed ledger options is where you can turn on and turn off journal approval workflow by specific for ledger by ledger. And then journal sources would be a configuration that determines which source goes through the journal approval workflow process. And so both of those really should be going through change control. And when we're building SOD conflicts, we're building what we call transaction versus configuration. We want transactions to be managed by end users and configurations to be managed by IT professionals as part of the change control process. So we're trying to evaluate whether or not somebody has access to both through within a role or across roles. I'm going to kind of cover this. I would just if you want to go back through the section in the part one, I'm kind of fly through this pretty quickly. But the big challenge organizations have is what rules are relevant. Like what risks do I need to be evaluating for which requirements? So is it Sarbanes-Oxley? Is it cybersecurity? Is it data security? Is it fraud? Is it theft? Is it license overages? And the challenge of this is trying to understand how the organization, how your organization or your organization you're auditing has defined its particular risk and control matrix. So I've got a decision tree process here, and to go through an RCM and defining what is an IT dependent control and what the dependency is. I kind of have a different viewpoint of how this process goes than you might have heard otherwise. So I'm just going to suggest that maybe go back and listen to the prior version of this, which I go through in a little more detail, but effectively you're trying to say which controls rely upon the system. The one thing I will note is that what a lot of auditors don't look at in the context of this is manual controls. And where a control is manual, it should be somebody has to take a report and review the report and validate, completeness and accuracy of the data entry and such. So that still requires some dependency. It still requires you to test access controls. So whoever's performing the controls should not have access to that activity. So otherwise, their independence as the control performer is impaired. So I covered that a lot in the last section. And then the last comment I'll make is often the RCMs, the risk control matrix, aren't complete. Like they may have a control in around journal entries. The control might say something like journal entries and batches are appropriately approved by management prior to be posting in ERP Cloud and FCCS. But the fact is there are other risks beyond what the workflow process is in of itself. So APIs, web services, data conversion processes like FBDI, Excel upload process like HCM data loader, and then potentially customizations if you're talking about on-prem systems. So when we look at the RCM, often we'll find the risk library isn't complete, or the way that some of these workflow processes can be bypassed haven't been taken into account from a control design perspective. All right, so this was the slide we just briefly touched on in the last session, and we're going to do all 10 of these different scenarios over the next couple of webinars. And the goal today is to get through role design and provisioning. So there's what we assert is there's 10 different scenarios where access control software is valuable. And role design and provisioning we're looking at in detail. You should consider it as part of your user access reviews as recertifications. If you are making a change to roles, you should be evaluating that, and that's going to be something we're going to cover: role change management, patch change management, I think development change management in session 3. And then whenever there'd be an incident, a cyber incident, so somebody's credentials are compromised, identifying what potentially could have happened with those compromised credentials as part of the cyber incident risk analysis. Testing the independent control performers, I just touched upon that a few minutes ago, making sure that people performing controls don't have access to things that they are evaluating. And then the execution of look-back procedures, there's lots of different times where look-back procedures need to be executed. And then the last is license exposure. So we're going to cover role design and provisioning today, and then the other 8 of these we're going to cover in the next couple of sessions. So role design. So you think about role design as really part of the original implementation. So that's what we're talking about, is kind of pre-implementation. There is a separate process to think about in the context of role changes or role change management that we'll talk about in a subsequent session. So I'm really talking about here, how do we get comfortable that a role prior to being implemented is, in theory, this should be done in a thorough manner. It should be done prior to the system go live. So how do we get confidence that the roles in and of themselves have the appropriate abilities within them, so they have the appropriate sensitive access risks, and to the extent that they would be what you would think of as SOD conflicts, they would be mitigated appropriately. So mitigation would typically come through the concept of an approval process. So the challenge is, like, we have like 2,900 different privileges and duty roles identified, and so when people hear the number of we have like 480 sensitive access rules, a couple 150 or something like that SOD rules. When people hear about a large, broad population of rules, which we do in our rules engine, the question is, how can you possibly use that data, that much data? And the answer is, how could you get comfortable with role design without having that much data, as our response. So what we do in the building of our rules engine is everything that has risk, has any associated risk with it. And we break it into 3 buckets. There's master data, there's configurations, and there's transactions. So if it has a risk associated with it, and that's an inherent risk, it's not a mitigated risk. So obviously you're going to think like enter journals and invoices and suppliers, all the traditional things that you guys probably think about. But and we have those in place as rules, but we also, in our cases, we have to, we do map page abilities, we map duty roles. So duty roles can give access to subject areas. And so I'm just going to take kind of a compliance viewpoint of this. I'm not going to take a data security view. So let's just say I'm scoping out SOD and sensitive access rules, and I'm asserting management's assessment of risk from a Sarbanes-Oxley perspective. So I would not need to look at duty roles, because typically data security, like access to PII or GDPR data, isn't really thought of as in scope from Sarbanes-Oxley perspective. Whether it should be, I think, is a whole nother discussion. Having said that, most external auditors would not look at the access to PII or the potential of data theft as part of in-scope from a Sarbanes-Oxley perspective. So we would take out page abilities because that's providing inquiry access. We would take out duty roles, and then we have a bunch of rules that are built to give access to license rules. So when we're looking at role design, we would want to look at all sensitive access risks other than page abilities, duty roles, and licenses. So we're kind of looking at everything that possibly could have risk, and we're going to run that against all the rules. Or we could decide we're going to run that against end user rules as a population to start, and whereas then we would be focusing on, like, the end users have access to the appropriate transactions and master data, and they shouldn't have any access to configuration. Or we may run this against IT roles and look to see if IT users have access to transactions and master data, and trying to understand where there's mitigating controls. So in SafePaaS, the nice thing about SafePaaS as an application is it has the concept of a rule tag. And so what we do in our rules library is we built what's called the mega tag, and that basically scans for all sensitive access rules and all SOD conflicts that are not license rules, page abilities, or duty roles. So this is where we're looking for a complete population of things that we'd expect to have a risk in and of themselves. And then we also then look secondarily at SOD risks. SafePaaS does have the ability to define rule tags. So that's just grouping different rules logically, which is a great thing to have. And I am going to invite Bob on. We've got a pre-recorded demo of this concept of running a full analysis by rule tag. So I am going to play the video, and Bob and I will make some comments and maybe even stop this video as we go. This was a video it has some audio, and we could provide the audio to this if you want to see this, but in this case, you guys aren't going to hear the audio, so Bob and I will make some comments as we go. So I'll just introduce this just briefly.
Jeff, you want me to kind of take over here?
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, this basically is the first form that an individual will see when they log in. You'll notice the inbox associated with the user. Each user gets an inbox for workflow notifications. We start looking at tags. You go into the setup area, and you can define as many rule tags as you feel are necessary and to meet your requirements. It's a pretty straightforward process. As simply as just hitting the create button and then putting in the components of the tag name, tag description, and the tag code, which would be part of the selection criteria during the SOD analysis. The next thing you want to do is you want to go to the SOD rules themselves. And here's where you can assign a tag to all your SOD policies that you have established. It's up to you as far as which ones you want to assign tags to. So here we're just going to show you one just by clicking on the hyperlink. These are all the different components of an SOD policy within SafePaaS. Here you can see we've got multiple privileges available for this in this particular role. And then when you go into the revise mode, you can go to tags. And here's the tags that are available to assign to this particular SOD policy. So you can assign one, you can assign multiples. And once again, these are all part of the selection criteria that you're going to use when you run your SOD analysis. And part of that selection criteria, which we'll show next, gives you the opportunity to, include tags as part of that evaluation. So only those rules that have one of those tags will be included in the SOD rule itself. I'm sorry, in the SOD analysis itself. And you've saved it, and what happens is when you submit it for approval, it goes to the control owner to allow that particular to take effect. And then when you go to the next thing we'll show you is just initiate an SOD analysis, detect violations, manage SOD, manage violations. And here's where you decide, the environment you want to work with, whether it's Oracle Cloud, EBS, or any other application. So we pick an environment, we create an SOD analysis name it whatever is appropriate based on how you want to track your SOD analysis by process or by whatever your naming conventions are. You put the name in there, you put a description, and I just copied this one across and for the description. Then here I could pick selection criteria for detective. I can also assign the rule tags that I've selected as part of the selection criteria. And when you initiate it, you create it, it'll start the SOD analysis, and once again, only filter and include those SOD rules that have the appropriate tag assigned to this particular test.
Cool. Thanks, Bob, for walking us through that. I'm going to go back.
My pleasure.
Yep. I'm going to go back to, so the beautiful thing about rule tags and the ability to kind of be more precise about what you're looking at is you can and should be filtering out the information based upon who's going to look at the data. So people think about compliance as a primary risk. And so from a CFO perspective, you may want to say these sets of rules are going to be focused on reporting out to the CFO. So there's a lot of SOD rules, that traditional things that people think about, like enter suppliers, enter invoices, enter suppliers POs, enter sales orders, pricing, invoicing, those type of things. So the typical financial risks. So what we would do if you want some help in this area, or what you could do as an administrator of SafePaaS internally, is you can build different rule tags for different stakeholders. So if the CFO is primarily focused on compliance, or if you're working with internal audit, for example, and trying to prepare for an external audit, I need to flip my display settings, sorry. You could build a set of rules that are specific to the CFO. And so the concept of mitigations is always an interesting thing to think about. So if you think about the workflow processes and have mitigations, you could document those mitigations outside the system on a spreadsheet, like that's kind of what we've done with clients at some point, is we've done a risk assessment on the front end. How do we come to the conclusion as to what rules are relevant for SOX compliance? And that can be done within a spreadsheet, and then you could then build a rule tag that just has the rules that are relevant, so that are the unmitigated risks, or the risks that aren't fully mitigated. Or you could do that within SafePaaS, enter mitigations that would go through an approval process before they're applied. But that would then be fully documented within the system. So there's kind of two different ways to approach that from a project perspective. But the beauty of rule tags is you could have a different sets of groupings of rules based upon different stakeholders. So the CISO may want to look at things that can bypass workflow approval process, web services, APIs, like mass update abilities like FBDI processes, HCM data loaders, things that can bypass controls, or maybe just purely, quote unquote cyber risks, who has the ability to extract data, large amounts of data, so PII data, especially if you're running like an HCM, who has BPM admin, or who has different web services and APIs that can pull data or mass update data. That might be what a CISO wants to do. A COO, on the other hand, may say, I want to know who has access to bill of materials, or item master, or inventory, because the attributes associated with inventory. I want to make sure that there's nobody outside of the expected team that has access to that. So that's the beauty of rule tags. Now, from looking at it from a role design perspective, as I went through the video, so what we suggest is whatever your objective is, what you're going to do is run all those sensitive access risks related to that using mega tags. And then what we do is we go in and we look at it from a role rule perspective. So this is what we call role pivot table. So this is extracting the data into a spreadsheet. And we have a role like AP invoice supervisor. And what I'm looking at is what rules are violated within that role. So what sensitive access rules. So we may have a sensitive access rule import conversion processes. So those are going to be things like FBDI abilities or conversion of data processes, interface processes, load filed interfaces, and then some things will just pop here. Why does an AP supervisor have some web service abilities or REST APIs? Is that really necessary for the UI to work, the user interface to work, or is it should we remove those from that role? So this is one way we look at the data. Once we do this big mass analysis using SafePaaS and we export the data, is we're going to say, look at it from a role rule. What just pops out here that doesn't make sense that an AP supervisor would have? And then another way of looking at the same data is looking at kind of the role object or role privilege perspective. Same role, AP invoice supervisor. And as you go through this, these are individual privileges, and you may or may not know the details of these privileges. And that's kind of what we do as a company is we build this risk content, we maintain it over time. We look at all these privileges, we map them to risks, and then we maintain these and add to these with each quarterly patch. So if you're looking at specific privileges and you're saying AP invoice supervisor, some of these will stand out like, yeah, this makes sense, and some of them will stand out, no, it doesn't make sense. Like applying or unapplying payables prepayments, that's kind of an invoice processor role, so that makes sense. Canceling invoices makes sense. Creating invoices by create payables invoice makes sense, but like create payables invoice by web service, like do they need access to a web service to be able to create an invoice? Probably not. That should come out. Create subledger journal entry online. That sounds like a journal entry function. Probably needs to come out. Definitely needs to come out. I can tell you that much. But I think you just kind of go through the process. When you get into individual like FBDI abilities, like import payables invoice, import payables payment request, this is really, I think, that these are the details that where the rubber meets the road, to be honest, because it's really easy to look at these and go, oh, import payables invoice. That's the invoice process that an AP supervisor should have. But the reality is that is an FBDI process that bypasses the workflow approval, where the workflow approval process would kick in when you do things through the user interface. So this is when I talked about like when a RACM is designed, they don't take into account all the risks. So there's really a risk. Entering the data through the user interface is a risk, and that is usually mitigated through a workflow process. Uploading an invoice through a background process, an FBDI process, or using a web service to modify something or an API where it doesn't go through the workflow approval process, that is a separate risk altogether. And effectively, that needs to be evaluated. There really should be a separate control. If you're going to allow somebody to import payables invoices manually, then the question you have to ask is, how do we know that those are authorized? How do we know that the file wasn't manipulated from the time it was provided to them? And changed the supplier, for example, increased invoice, decreased invoice. So how do you confirm the integrity of the data that has been invoiced relative to what was quote unquote approved to be invoiced? So that's where this is where the rubber meets the road from a role design perspective. Is literally you should be looking at every privilege and in a given role and ask the question, do these really belong? The challenge is for most organizations is Oracle doesn't always provide good detail or understanding of what these are, and so the average person is going to say, well, if I remove this and the functionality, it takes away functionality, then this role is not going to be able to work. So I'm going to be less likely to remove something from a role that I think it might need, unless I really understood these privileges in detail. And that's what we do through ERP Armor, is we understand these privileges in detail. And so what we do for some companies is they look at it from a rule perspective. So AP config setups, that's a grouping of configurations that should go through change control. Create manual SLA journal entries. That happens to be, I think if I remember correctly, create subledger journal entry online. And there was one more, I think, somewhere. Manage subledger journal and free entry manually. Those are processes that shouldn't be entered or maintained by an AP supervisor. Oh, I'm missing a slide or two. So, shoot. I was going to go through, maybe this is an old set of slides. I was going to go through the what if analysis too in this section. So that's what we would do from a role design perspective. I guess I don't have the demo slide for the what if analysis. So the second part of this we were going to cover is the what if analysis. So we talked about role design, and role design is looking at roles in and of themselves, but the reality is most users are going to be assigned more than one role. So the question then is, what risks are evident, or what risks do we have to evaluate in the context of a user having access to more than one role? So this is certainly something that should be done pre-go live as well, because you're not just looking at the roles, but you're looking at aggregation of roles or the stacking of roles. And then on an ongoing basis, as a new role is assigned to a user, then you should also be evaluating what's the potential impact of that new role assignment, or what we refer to as a what if analysis. So now we're going to look at the what if analysis video that Bob put together, and I'm going to let him walk you through this as this video rolls.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Here we see the login screen again, and when it comes to what if analysis, that's covered in a couple different areas within SafePaaS. The first is the roles manager or role designer, where we can redesign roles and responsibilities and do a simulation of any intra-role violations, so you're not creating violations by the design of that particular role. The true what if analysis is in the I-access capabilities, where you request user provisioning. So we're going to walk you through the setup, and here we pick our environment that we're going to be using. We select the environment, the EBS demo environment that we have for I-access. And here we have what we call registered users that have access to the ERP. Not you don't have the entire user population. It's going to be given access only those that are registered. So it's a level of security within SafePaaS. And so we're going to select one of these individuals that we're going to provision. We'll pick A. Jones, and we'll click on Go. And so clicking on Go will bring all the pertinent information relative to this particular user. And if we scroll down, you'll see all the other roles or responsibilities assigned to this user. And to Jeff's point, there's always the cumulative access that they have, regardless of what's in a single role. So here we've got some examples of what's assigned to this individual, Mr. Jones, Adrian Jones. And then once that's established, we go to next. Here we have the opportunity to add additional roles and responsibilities to this user. We do have a firefighter capability. It's not pertinent to what we're covering here, but as you can see, it's pretty straightforward, where I can end data user access if I so choose. But when I select another role of responsibility, and we'll just pick one within the demonstration. Just bring it across. You can bring over across multiples, and we click on next. And here it shows you that role that we just selected. Gives you a start date. You can end date it if it's a temporary access. If there's others that are temporary, you can other responsibilities or roles you want to end date. You can do that also. And we click on next. And what happens right now, the simulation process is occurring for this request. And what happens once the SOD process has been completed, the reviewers and approvers will get an inbox notification telling them that they have a request that needs to be reviewed and approved if acceptable. But part of that, when you go and also Mr. Jones gets a notification also. So if I believe go back into SafePaaS, and you'll go to another user. Once again, it's workflow. I'm gonna log in as a different user. And here we get an inbox notification for all the workflows. In this particular case, is for user provision and request. We need to sort it based on to get the most recent analysis results. And then we click on the hyperlink associated with that request. And here they can accept it or reject it. If they reject it, they have to put a textual reason why. But if we scroll down, you'll see the SOD violations that are potentially going to be generated if you give this person access within the ERP itself. So that way the reviewers and approvers can make a determination if this is something acceptable to the organization. And if so, once again, SafePaaS will pick up the request and process it all the way through into the ERP. And it's all predicated on the number of reviews and approvers. We typically start with, 3, but we allow up to 5. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I think the partially what this highlights, because it does scan for all the SOD and sensitive access violations, is the need to really make sure you have a good understanding what your mitigating controls are and documenting those. And there should be a consistent approach to be able to maintain those and revalidate those on a consistent basis. And then the control owners that are approving those, like Bob said, there could be one or more people that review that process as they go through. They need to make sure that they have visibility to what's an acceptable mitigating control and what's not. So that's a big part of, I think, a mature project is doing that initial mapping from the risk control matrix, identifying what really are the critical in-scope SOD and sensitive access risks, identifying where there are mitigating controls, and then making sure that that gets maintained on a regular basis. So I'm going to wrap up here. If anybody has any questions about our subject today or the subject from the prior sessions, let us know. If you are using any of the products, really the SafePaaS products, we do support. ERP Armor supports just about every ERP system on the market. We're really strong right now in the ERP cloud space as well. So we have a couple of other webinars coming up. The next webinar we're going to look at is user access reviews, recertifications, and role change management. And then, anyways, you can see the upcoming webinars here. I think actually we're going to move these around a little bit. So if you're interested in our webinar or our newsletter, you can click on this link or have access to this link, or you can send us a email at support@erparea.net to sign up for our monthly newsletter, which we highlight some of these issues. And then what we're offering to those that are attending today, there's a class that we have that's a paid class. It's a 3-hour class, why access control should be tested for all in-scope systems, covering some of these topics and some others. That would be free to anybody that attends today. If you want to send us open a ticket with us, we'll enroll you in that class. We will also enroll you in the 3 classes we talked about as prerequisites in the first couple of slides. So really ERP cloud specific stuff. But yeah, so it's 4.5 hours of CPE total if you're interested. The 3 free classes and this 1 paid class is, I think this is an 1.5-hour class. I don't think about it. So the combined classes are 4.5 hours of free CPE. And it looks like to me that I don't see any questions.
So we did have a question, Jeff. Okay, so this person asks, so the workflows need to offer both SOD and sensitive access review to get a holistic picture?
Ask the question again.
So workflows need to offer both SOD and sensitive access review.
I'm not quite sure I fully understand that. So let me talk about how we look at workflows in the context of mitigating risks from a sensitive access and an SOD perspective. And I'm just going to go back to the very beginning, looking at a couple of traditional SOD risks. So if we're looking at, so you really should be thinking about the workflow mitigating risk in the context of both sensitive access risk and SOD risks. And that is because in and of itself, like suppliers in and of itself is a risk. So the unauthorized maintenance of the name, the address, the ACH bank account number, or the contact information would potentially allow somebody to commit fraud without going into a lot of detail. So what we would be doing is looking for the workflow design to mitigate, to make sure that if somebody makes a change to an ACH or an EFT bank account information, it's going to go through an approval process. They make a change to a name, it's going to go through an approval process. They make a change to an address or a contact information, it's going to go through approval process. So one person can't do just do the data entry and not be independently reviewed by somebody else. So that's what we'll be looking at from a supplier's perspective. Now, if the workflow process was in place for all 4 of those scenarios I mentioned, both inserts and updates, then we would consider that workflow as reliable. If it wasn't in place for all of those, then we would consider that a design flaw or a control design gap, that the workflow hasn't fully mitigated all the risks for all those different scenarios. So 4 pieces of data, both inserts and updates. There's kind of like 8 different scenarios, if you will. When we get into SOD conflicts, like enter suppliers and enter payables invoices, if there was no workflow for either one of those, somebody could enter a supplier, no workflow, basically setting up a fictitious supplier, and they can enter an invoice and there's no workflow, basically entering an invoice against a fictitious supplier, then that allows somebody to commit fraud. But if our primary goal is to prevent somebody from entering a supplier and invoices, the fact that we had, let's just say we had back to my first comments, like enter suppliers workflow process was properly built. So effectively then, the only way somebody could commit fraud, or if they want to enter a fraudulent invoice, let's say that the invoice process wasn't subject to workflow, and they wanted to enter a fraudulent invoice, they'd only be able to enter that fraudulent invoice against a valid supplier. So then that would, in order for somebody to get money out of it, which is what they're trying to do, or gain value out of that fraud, they would have to collude with a supplier that got paid for that invoice. So in most cases, collusion isn't something, that auditors think can be mitigated. And I think to some extent I agree. There are some ways I think that controls can and should be entered to be able to deter or prevent fraud. But back to my scenario, if I'm looking at enter supplier to enter payables invoices as an SOD conflict, and I have a fully mitigated workflow process that's reliable on the supplier side, then I don't really care if somebody has enter suppliers and enter payables invoices, because that supplier master risk is fully mitigated. And so, like, to my point, unless I'm looking at the other risk, which is collusion as a second risk, then I've got to worry about payables invoices. But most of the time, from a compliance perspective, collusion isn't brought into Sarbanes-Oxley scope. So mostly what we would look at is, as long as there's a workflow approval process there, then I wouldn't even look at this as an SOD conflict at all. If I'm thinking about what's happening through the user interface itself, the UI, the fact of the matter is there are import processes for enter suppliers and there are import processes for enter payables invoices, both of which bypass the that aren't subject to or bypass the workflow approval process. So you can make an argument you should be looking at access controls in 2 different buckets: those that are potentially subject to workflow, and those that are not, are definitely not subject to workflow. So that's the way I would look at those risks. And that's the way we look at control design. Are the proper controls in place related to what happens through the user interface, i.e., is workflow properly designed? And are the proper controls in place to secure the abilities where somebody is bypassing or it's not subject to the workflow approval process? And if you don't have controls built for both scenarios, then effectively you have not designed access controls appropriately. So I hope that answers your question, whoever asked that. And I think we are at time. So thank you all for attending. If you have questions that I can answer, if you have a follow-up question on that, you can certainly attend the next session, or you could open a ticket with us if you want. And I just want to say thanks to Emma for hosting and for Bob for helping out and participating and providing the videos and the color on how SafePaaS can be used. So with that, I think we end, and we'll see you guys in the next session.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks everyone
Jeff.
for attending. Thanks. Bye.